Hey there everybody, this is the kind of video that you weren't expecting, but I feel like I have to talk about it. I mean, it's nothing too serious regarding me. It's just, we are doing local profiling episode 13, but unfortunately, it's a special emergency edition on a different locomotive that wasn't included in my voting poll. Normally it would be Lord Nelson, Southern Railway number 850. But no. Obviously, about a week ago, something has come up that takes priority. So instead, welcome to a special emergency edition of Local Profiling, where hopefully this will be the only emergency edition. So the new subject for episode 13 is going to be Canadian Pacific 2816. Yeah, I'm actually going to talk about a Canadian steam locomotive for the first time. And sorry if this is going to be a little bit of a different style video. I'm just mostly going to film myself while also look at some notes and then talk about the main reason why I'm doing this episode, which is of course a rather recent and unfortunate event regarding the 2816. So let's see. The engine was obviously the engine was part of the H1 class locomotives, which were 464 Hudsons built for the Canadian Pacific Railroad. Or I guess I should say railway, because in Canada they prefer to use the word railway instead of railroad, but whatever. But yeah, the H1 Hudsons. There were 65 of them built across 5 different batches, collectively numbered 2800 through 2864, being built by the Montreal Locomotive Works between 1929 and 1940. And regardless of which different batch we're talking about, by the way, yes, the 5 batches are collected. The 5 batches are classified as H1A, B, C, D, and E. All of them do actually have the exact same tractive effort, which is nice. 45,254 pounds. That was generated by 275 psi of boiler pressure, a pair of 22 by 30-inch cylinders, and 75-inch driving wheels. And as you can see on this chart, when it comes to the collective numbering scheme, you notice that locomotive 2816, the engine that we're going to talk about, was part of the H1B series, built in 1930, December of 1930, specifically for that engine. Let's see, it operated on different types of passenger service for the Canadian Pacific until being withdrawn from service in May of 1960. And then it was bought by Francis Nelson Blount, an American fishing baron, if I remember correctly, who is also obviously and rightfully remembered as one of the most important steam locomotive preservationists of the United States, because he set up the Steamtown USA collection in Bellows Falls, Vermont. And he bought the 2816 as a bit of a constellation because he wanted to have a Hudson locomotive, but he would have preferred one of the New York Central Hudson locomotives, which by this point in time were all extinct, sadly. So, yeah. And the locomotive remained part of the Steamtown collection for quite some time, even during the move to Scranton, Pennsylvania in the winter of 1983 and 84. Though when it comes to the Steamtown collection and the museum, that wouldn't be reorganized into the Steamtown National Historic Site until somewhere in 1985 or 86. And then in 1998, the locomotive left Steamtown because it was sold back to Canadian Pacific. It was moved back to Canada, specifically to the BC Rail Steam Shops in North Vancouver, British Columbia. Sorry if I'm kind of rubbing my my eye a little bit teary for some reason. Then for the next 2 years or so, the locomotive underwent the most extensive restoration of a Canadian steam locomotive since the end of the steam era there. Like, the repairs were very extensive, and there were a number of modifications done to the locomotive as well, such as being converted to oil burning, the installation of radios, a diesel control unit, and ditch lights. And all that, by the way, all those repairs and the new additions and the modifications, that came at a price of 2 million Canadian dollars. Feel free to convert that into American dollars or whatever, what that was back then, at least. And then it was put into service for Canadian Pacific as a goodwill ambassador and a public relations locomotive as part of their steam program. And they had a good decade or so of rail tours and excursions. So they got a lot of mileage out of the locomotive, and it was very well liked in Canada and even the United States. And then the engine was unexpectedly sidelined in June of 2012 when CP President Fred Green had stepped down, and he was replaced with the great professor and connoisseur of cost cutting, Ewing Hunter Harrison. And he was the kind of man who believed that a steam locomotive didn't have any additional value to a modern company. Like I said, he was a man of cost cutting. So he looked at the steam locomotive and the excursion program as financial liabilities. And during his presidency, the 2816 would sadly be tucked into storage at the Canadian Pacific Steam Shops in Calgary, Alberta, effectively turning that building into a mausoleum. Okay, that's a bit harsh to say, but the locomotive wasn't allowed to leave that building. It was stuck in there, even though thankfully it was at least very well maintained. Though, quite surprisingly, but somewhat understandably, it remained in storage for quite some time, even after Harrison stepped down as president of the Canadian Pacific in January of 2017. He was then replaced with the next president, Keith Creel, who, he wasn't dismissive to the steam program. He liked the idea of having a steam engine serve as a goodwill ambassador for the railway, force of habit. But immediately putting it back into service after Harrison left, not necessarily the right call. So he was a man, he was a more realistic and patient man. He wanted to have the locomotive back into service when the time was right. So, yeah. First, he need to fix all the financial damage and catastrophe that Harrison had inflicted. As for the 2816, then it briefly returned to steam towards the end of 2020 to, as an assessment, checking to make sure the locomotive was still in good shape, which it was. Then it was used for filming the CP's holiday train event. And then it made a proper return to steam in 2023 after an overhaul, followed by some test runs around Calgary. Now, of course, that 2023 overhaul and those test runs, those were a prelude. They were just small preparations for something. Because one little bit of history that I kind of skipped, which I'm going to mention now, was in 2021, when the Canadian Pacific formed a merger with the Kansas City Southern Railroad. So that together the two companies would become the Canadian Pacific Kansas City, or CPKC for short. Yeah, I'm just going to continue calling them CP, or Canadian Pacific. Maybe CPR. But I'm not going to call them CPKC. Because the way that I look at it, Canadian Pacific is still the most dominant company. But what this merger between Canadian Pacific and KCS meant was that now things were also being prepped out for a really big trip called the Final Spike Steam Tour. The idea was that 2816 would make a huge amount of history by becoming the first steam locomotive to travel across the entire North American continent. So it was no longer just confined to running in Canada and the United States. It could travel even further south. Yeah, it could travel the other U.S. border into Mexico. And there were plans to have it run all the way down to Mexico City, which, no, that isn't located very close to the U.S. border. It's pretty deep, pretty far south into the country. And in hindsight, yeah, the final Spike Steam Tour, it was a mistake. A gigantic mistake. Because realistically, all we can really talk about is the absurdity and stupidity that was shown by that was fully displayed by the Mexican people. There was virtually no crowd control. Many people were just trespassing on the railroad, standing on the tracks. There were a few close calls, such as this guy actually trying to hitch a ride by climbing onto the observation carriage at the back of the train, or this girl who got her phone bitch slapped out of her hands by the right-hand cylinder of the locomotive because she was standing a little bit too close to the track, but thankfully she did walk away with perhaps just a heart attack and a broken phone. But of course, the one major thing that the Mexican portion of this steam tour gave us was a tragedy, because there was a woman standing even closer to the tracks at one point, trying to take a selfie or perhaps filming herself with the locomotive approaching. Unfortunately, there was a very disturbing piece of video footage of her, which does actually show her getting hit and killed by the locomotive. Yeah, the right-hand cylinder struck again. That woman was hit in the back of her head at a speed of around at least 40 miles an hour. Some people even said that she might have died before she even fell to the ground. Yeah, it's eerily similar to the incident that Union Pacific 844 had in July of 2018 during the Cheyenne Frontier Day trips that year, where there was also a woman standing too close to the track, and she was struck and killed by the locomotive. Yeah, it's a disaster. Like I said, that final Spike Steam Tour was a complete mistake. And what's even more tragic is that there was a small boy standing next to that woman at the time. There are a lot of people saying that that boy was her son. And if that's true, well, tragically, he's going to have to spend the rest of his childhood without a mom. Yeah, honestly, it's very upsetting that this is the only major talking point of this big tour for the 2816. It's a terrible way for such a well-liked locomotive to make a return to service. And my honest opinion about it, well, because of that incident, the Canadian Pacific did actually kind of take notes from the Union Pacific by enforcing a minimum distance for staying away from the tracks to film their trains, and especially the steam train for the rail tours and the excursions, from a safe distance without any major incident. With the Union Pacific Railroad, that minimum distance is 25 feet. The Canadian Pacific went even further with a minimum distance of 10 meters, which for the staunchest of American viewers watching this who are allergic to the metric system, that's about 33 feet. But honestly, I don't think that that's going to be enough. If I were the president of the Canadian Pacific, I would go a step further and actually make a statement where the 2816 would be officially and permanently banned from ever running into Mexico again. Keep it confined to Canada and the United States. As far as I'm concerned, the Mexicans, no, they may not enjoy this locomotive on their trackage again. because it's a catastrophe. It's just, there's just far too much risk involved. It's not worth it. Heck, at one point, I think after that tragic incident, there were even a bunch of soldiers from an armed guard who had to keep the enthusiasts at a safe distance. It's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. And yeah, honestly, for the safety of all the people, and especially for the locomotive crew who didn't want to go to Mexico, apparently, or were at least seriously dreading it, I hope that the 2816 is never allowed to go to Mexico again. Keep it as far south as Texas or New Mexico. You know, America, United States. That's all I have to say. And apologies that this is such a tragic and perhaps slightly rushed episode of Loco Profiling, but I felt like I had to get it off my chest. But yeah, we're not talking about happy times right now. So, yeah, obviously, it's okay that you don't feel sorry for the woman who was hit and killed because it was her own stupidity that got her killed. But at the same time, you do gotta feel sorry for the train crew and even that woman's son. Yeah, that's all I have. See you next time.